Hello and welcome back to the Fantasy Playmakers. What's up, guys? In today's video, I'm going to be doing another mock draft. I'm going to try to post at least one mock draft every single day up until the season. So just so you guys know, stay on the lookout for all of those. But for this specific mock draft, it's going to be a 10-team league, PPR scoring. We're going to be drafting from the 5th slot. This was a suggestion that someone commented in my last mock draft. So if you guys, have specific settings that you want me to draft from, comment down below and I'll try to do, as many of those as I can. And then it's going to be a pretty standard roster setup. 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, a flex, 1 defense, 1 kicker, and 6 bench slots. So let's get right into it. So the first 4 picks of this draft were Christian McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, and Saquon Barkley. I think the first through 3rd pick, were pretty standard for what you're going to see in drafts. Saquon Barkley, I personally would not be taking him this early with the injury and offensive line concerns, but I could definitely see this happening in real drafts. I know at least on ESPN, I did a draft recently and I was surprised that they had Saquon ranked as like their 3rd or 4th overall player. So it definitely depends kind of what site you're drafting on, what players are pushed up, the overall rankings. It makes people see them and want to draft them. But him going at the 104, I think gives us a really solid option here at the 105. I have a pretty locked in top 4 running backs, and that's McCaffrey, Cook, Kamara, and Derrick Henry. And lucky for us, Derrick Henry here has fallen to us at the 105. So I think this is a pretty clear pick in my mind. I guess you could make an argument for Zeke or Aaron Jones, but I just like the consistency and reliability that Derrick Henry is going to give you on a week-to-week basis. He's always on the field and really can be a league winner with how well he performs down the stretch. After we took Derrick Henry, we saw Ezekiel Elliott get drafted at the 106, then Devontae Adams and Travis Kelce went off the board back-to-back. Jonathan Taylor at the 109 and Tyreek Hill at the 110. A pretty standard kind of first round ADP, pretty close to what you're going to see in a lot of your drafts. And then to start off the second round, still very running back heavy with Chubb, Eckler, and Jones going as the first 3 picks. Then Diggs and then Najee Harris leads us into our pick here at the 206. We already have 1 workhorse running back. I do think it'd be nice to have another one. The way that I like to look at it, even though there are some solid options here at wide receiver like Hopkins and Ridley, those guys are back-to-back in my rankings. I just think the value in the 3rd round is so much better at the wide receiver position than it is at running back. You can go out right now and get a workhorse running back in the 2nd round and still be able to get, a wide receiver 1, a guy like Keenan Allen, Allen Robinson in the middle of the 3rd round. At running back, you're not guaranteed that any of those guys are going to fall to you, so I'm going to lock in at the RB position here, and it's going to be between 2 players, Antonio Gibson and Joe Mixon. I think Antonio Gibson is probably the safer option. He performed very well as a rookie, probably going to have an expanded role this season, and there's just not a lot of red flags with him. With Mixon, there's some red flags, but there's also just a crazy high upside. Obviously, he's busted in back-to-back seasons, which is definitely not ideal. But when I'm looking at his potential workload, he could realistically see, around 20 carries a game, 5+ targets on an offense that's likely going to be much improved from last year. And I think I'm going to take a little bit of a risk here. I went safe with Derrick Henry, very reliable. I feel like I've set myself up to be able to take a swing on Joe Mixon and buy in on that really high ceiling. And so that's where I'm going to go for my RB2. At the end of the 2nd round, we saw 2 wide receivers, the first quarterback in Patrick Mahomes, then Antonio Gibson all come off the board. And then the first 4 picks of the 3rd round were all wide receivers. This round is probably going to be pretty dominated by the wide receiver position. And so it was Metcalf, Brown, Jefferson, and Keenan Allen all coming off from the 301 to the 304, leading into our pick here. And I'm a little bit disappointed that Keenan Allen went off the board. He's kind of a guy that I really like to target at that spot. A guy that I view as a mid-tier wide receiver 1. But he didn't fall to us here. There are still some decent options on the board. Maybe a guy like Allen Robinson would probably be my favorite guy available. There's also still some solid options at the running back position. You have CEH, probably be the top guy in my rankings there. But someone from the tight end position is kind of standing out to me as a pretty solid pick. I may have CEH higher in my overall rankings, but because I already have 2 workhorse running backs, I feel like I can go, maybe in a different direction and snag a tight end just because Darren Waller is going to give me a really solid positional advantage. It's Kelce and then it's Waller and Kittle, and then there's just a lot of separation in my mind from the rest of the field. Darren Waller isn't a guy that I've been consistently targeting just because his ADP has kind of risen into the second round. But, going in the middle of a third round in a 10-team league, I think that's more of a fair spot for him to go. So I'm definitely willing to draft him at this price. At the end of the third round and the start of the fourth, we saw a pretty balanced mix of running backs and wide receivers with George Kittle thrown in there. And so we have our fourth round pick coming up. So far, we've got Derrick Henry and Joe Mixon at running back, Darren Waller at tight end. So with this pick, it'd be ideal that there'd be some value at the wide receiver position. And there are two main guys that are sticking out to me here. Chris Carson at running back. I really like this value, in the middle of the fourth round. But I do also really like Amari Cooper. And I do just think I'm going to have to lean towards Amari Cooper with this pick because I don't have any wide receivers. And if I'm looking ahead, to the next round, guys that may be in the range of being drafted, the DJ Moore, Julio Jones, Deontay Johnson kind of players, I'd feel fine with them, as my wide receiver one. It wouldn't be optimal, but, it'd be okay. But what I'd be worried about is then who am I looking at for my wide receiver two? Then you're kind of getting into this Jamar Chase, Odell Beckham, Juju Smith range, and that's not something I really want to buy into. So I'm going to go with Amari Cooper, kind of play it safe to build a more balanced lineup, but it does hurt to pass up on Chris Carson at this price that I think is really nice for him. No surprise that Chris Carson comes off the board right after our pick. He goes at the 407. Then we had four straight wide receivers with Godwin, Julio, Kupp, and Deontay Johnson. Then Miles Sanders and Josh Allen back-to-back in the fifth round. Juju Smith going at the 504. Way too early in my mind, but hopefully that left some value at the wide receiver position for us with that reach there. Now, we could go running back, but I think my point kind of still stands where if we go running back here, then we're looking at the wide receivers, and it's not exactly pretty. It's probably going to be slim pickings and maybe even a guy that I don't feel comfortable with starting on a week-to-week basis, which is not a good spot to put yourself in, especially, week one. You haven't even had any injuries yet. So Darrell Henderson, could be an option here, but for all the reasons I mentioned, I think I'm just going to lock in at wide receiver, and I think there's a pretty clear guy here. It's going to be DJ Moore. I really like him this season. I think he's a very talented weapon. I'm not really scared off by Sam Darnold being the quarterback. I don't think really he can be much worse than Teddy Bridgewater was. And now you have Curtis Samuel no longer there. Hopefully some vacated targets that DJ Moore can eat into. And he's going to be the pick here to be my wide receiver too. Wow, we actually got pretty lucky here because just so many wide receivers came off the board. No running backs were picked to end the fifth or start of the sixth round. So we had Thielen, Lockett, Ayuk, Galladay, and Chase go off in the fifth. Then Odell, Kyler, Claypool, Pitts, and Lamar Jackson in the sixth round. So with our sixth round pick, we may have some value at running back and maybe even wide receiver because I see that T. Higgins is still available. That may make me think I could have gone Darrell Henderson in the last round, but he's somehow still here. So I'm looking at running back. I do like T. Higgins, but getting that third kind of workhorse back I think is really important at this ADP. And so I'm looking at two guys. It's going to be Darrell Henderson and Mike Davis. And this is probably a little bit of a call between upside and safety. I think Mike Davis may have the more locked in, overall touches, but I don't think he has the same ceiling. I know some people are still skeptical on Mike Davis, another player I talked about in the video I posted this morning. But you just look at this depth chart for the Falcons. Cordero Patterson is the number 2 running back, and he is a wide receiver. So that tells you all you need to know about Mike Davis getting a lot of touches this season. But for Darrell Henderson, they haven't brought in veteran competition. It seems like they're ready to just roll with him as the RB1. And if he can get that same workload that Cam Akers was lined up to get, he could be one of the best values in the entire draft. You're basically getting him like 5 rounds after you could have gotten Cam Akers. So I'm going to go with him here in the flex. And if he pans out, this running back room is going to be stacked. And to get him in the 6th round, I think is going to be great. After our Darrell Henderson pick, we had every position come off the board. Mark Andrews and TJ Hawkinson both went towards the end of the 6th round. Michael Thomas went at the 609. We had Josh Jacobs also go in that 6th round. And then we had quarterbacks Dak Prescott and Justin Herbert go in the 7th round, along with the young wide receivers Higgins and Devontae Smith. And so that leads into our 705 selection. Right now, we basically have our entire starting lineup filled out, except for quarterback, then obviously defense and kicker. So right now, though, we have 3 running backs because we have Henderson in the flex, 2 wide receivers, So it probably would be nice to balance out that wide receiver position. But when I'm looking at this board, we have Mike Davis still available here. We do also have solid options at wide receiver with guys like Robbie Anderson. But I mean, Mike Davis, I'm really buying into him this year. That's why I talked about him as a must-own player. So I'm going to have to think about that. We could also look at the quarterback position. We do still have Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers on the board, but I kind of have this strategy in 10-team leagues. I've talked about how I like these late-round quarterbacks, Brady, Stafford, those guys. And so I don't really care if I'm the last guy to pick a quarterback, right? Because if the first 9 teams pick quarterback, I'm still going to have one of these guys available, right? So it's going to be Wilson, Rodgers, Tannehill, or Brady. And that means that I'm going to be able to wait a few rounds later than these other players and just get these guys at a major discount. I just have to make sure I pick my first quarterback before people start getting their backup. And that really allows me to maximize the value at every other position. So I am going to have to think here, do I go with Mike Davis as my RB4, where he's going to be on the bench, or do I get my wide receiver 3, still going to be on the bench, but is more likely to kind of crack into my lineup? And I really think the value here with Mike Davis is just too good in the 7th round. I think he's going to be a workhorse. The running back position is very thin, and I mean, he's even going as the 22nd ranked running back, so someone's going to need, to trade for a running back. Injuries are going to happen 100%, so I'm going to go with him here. Probably, not the highest upside play for my starting lineup, but, for season-long value, I think this is going to be a very solid pick, and the wide receiver depth at the position is just crazy. So I'm going to be able to pick up some later round options that I think, are going to have the upside to break into my starting lineup. A pretty heavy mix of wide receivers and running backs finished up the 7th and started the 8th round with Aaron Rodgers thrown in there at the 7:08. So it's our pick in the 8th round. Right now, we have 1 tight end, we have 4 running backs, 2 wide receivers. Our quarterback spot is still open, and I did talk about how I had that strategy of kind of waiting towards the end to get one of these, solid late round quarterbacks and have some value. But Russell Wilson is still on the board, and even though I don't really love him, I think I'm lower on him than consensus, I do think drafting him here in the 8th round is definitely a steal, so I'm definitely considering that. Not going to be looking at the running back position because I have 4, solid locked-in running backs that I feel confident starting. If a wide receiver is really sticking out to me as some great value, then I'll probably go with that over Russell Wilson. So let's look at the guys. We've got Tyler Boyd, Brandon Cooks, Deebo Samuel, Will Fuller, Jarvis Landry, Antonio Brown. So what I'm looking at is some guys that I kind of like, Brandon Cooks, maybe Antonio Brown, but no one's really sticking out as like a crazy solid value. So I think I'm going to pull the trigger on Russell Wilson here, fill out that starting lineup. Obviously, when I look back on this team, the wide receiver position is definitely going to be lacking just because I only have 2 guys now, and I waited to draft those guys, and I still have to fill out that position. But basically, the rest of the draft is probably going to be centered on me just getting that value at the wide receiver position just to make sure, I have some safe plays and some high upside guys. So I'm definitely going to need to draft well to finish up that position group. After we picked Russell Wilson, we saw David Johnson, Tyler Boyd, Michael Pittman, and James Robinson round out the 8th. And then we saw AB, Brandon Cooks, Deebo Samuel, and Michael Carter go to start off the 9th round. And that's a little bit disappointing because AB and Brandon Cooks were the 2 guys that I was looking at in the last round. So it's definitely unfortunate that those guys came off the board here. But I still just have to go wide receiver. Got 4 running backs, a quarterback, a tight end. I really can't go in any other direction, or else my wide receiver room is just going to be absolute garbage. So if we're looking at the guys, we've got Will Fuller, Jarvis Landry, Laviska, Curtis Samuel, Corey Davis. So I think the best guy right here is Will Fuller. I would also consider Curtis Samuel, but I kind of need a guy who I think is going to have a little bit of upside. I do think Curtis Samuel has that, but he's dealt with COVID. It seems like it hit him pretty hard, and I just don't know how well he's going to be able to integrate into this offense on a new team and produce right away. Will Fuller obviously is suspended for the first game of the season, but I just think he has a lot of upside as a player. He was a wide receiver 1 in points per game last season, and obviously the situation is much worse. You're going from being Deshaun Watson's number 1 target, fitting in with his skill set, to being still probably the number 1, but on a team with Tua, not exactly matching up with Tua's skills, but he still has that ability. And so, to be able to get him in the ninth round, it seems like he has a lot of upside. He could definitely kind of bust and just be a very inconsistent week to week play. But I'm just going to try to buy in on the talent here. I'm not a huge fan of him as my wide receiver 3. It's probably not great, but the best we're going to get at this slot. Once again, another finish and start to a round that was heavily filled with running backs and wide receivers. No quarterbacks or tight ends went to finish out the ninth and start the 10th. We did actually have 2 defenses come off the board with the Bucks and the Steelers. I'm never going to pick a defense that early. I like to wait because I just end up streaming defenses off the waiver wire. I feel like that's just like the best thing to do, because even if you have a great defense, if they go up against a great offense, like if your defense is playing the Chiefs or the Bucks, you probably don't feel confident starting them. And I'm not trying to like drop a real position player to pick up a second defense. It's just a situation I like to avoid. But with this pick, we're still going to be locked in at wide receiver. We've got Mike Williams available. Don't really like it. People have been kind of pushing him as a sleeper. I'm not really seeing it. If anything, I think it's going to be one of these younger wideouts on the Chargers that really breaks out, not the guy that's had so many opportunities and hasn't really done it. Devontae Parker, not interested in him. Darnell Mooney could have some potential there. I do actually like Marvin Jones Jr. at this slot. He just kind of consistently puts together solid seasons and just always seems to outperform his ADP. So he's definitely an option with this pick. I'm going to go with him here because I do think he has a legit shot at kind of emerging as the wide receiver 1. Not saying it's the most likely outcome. It could obviously be Chark. It could be Laviska. It could be all 3 of these guys, battling for the same touches and none of them really break out. But I mean, he has the lowest ADP of all of them. So I'm just going to take a little swing here and go with Marvin Jones. Another finish to the 10th round and start of the 11th with running backs and wide receivers. Basically, in the last, I think it is 4 rounds, we've had 1 quarterback come off, 0 tight ends, so just very dominated in this range by running backs and wide receivers. We have our 11th pick, probably still going back to the well here on wide receivers. We are even on running backs and wide receivers, have 4 at each position, but our running backs are so obviously the strong spot that we do kind of just need to balance this out. When we're looking at the guys available, Devontae Parker, not interested. Hardman, not really interested. T.Y., maybe. Elijah Moore could have a shot, but I just don't really buy into this Jets passing offense, at least this year, especially with so many cooks in the kitchen. Russell Gage is actually a guy that I think is a great pick at this spot. He is going to be the wide receiver 2 this year, now that Julio is gone. Actually put together a pretty under-the-radar, impressive 2020 season. In 16 games, he had 786 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns. I mean, he's still a young guy going into his 4th NFL season. He could really make a big leap this year. And so I think he's a nice pick here who has some upside, but also just probably has some safety as a wide receiver 2 of what's probably going to be a pretty solid passing game. We finally saw some other positions start to come off the board. Some teams going out and getting their second tight end. We had Logan Thomas come off. Also some quarterbacks, Brady and Tannehill. Fant and Goddard going in the 12th. Some of these lower tier running backs going as well. So it's our pick at the 12:06. We have 2 bench slots left. Honestly, we're probably going wide receiver again, unless there's some value somewhere else that we think is too good to pass up. In some of these other drafts, I've gone out and gotten a second quarterback, Jalen Hurts, Matthew Stafford. I think these guys are great value at their current slot, but I also just don't know if I can pass up a wide receiver because that position is so weak. And I do think Russell Wilson is also just a pretty solid guy that you can start on a week-to-week basis, assuming he doesn't just totally fall off a cliff in the second half of the season like he's done the last 2 years. So if we're looking at wide receivers, probably my favorite guy here is Cole Beasley, just a very consistent option. Could look Rashad Bateman, but he is dealing with that injury. That's probably going to restrict him to start off this season and probably just hurt his overall stock because he's not getting those training camp reps. So Beasley would probably be the best receiver here, but I do wonder if I take a little bit of a risk here, get the quarterback, and then hope Beasley is still there. If he's not, I mean, there's still some other options below him. Maybe a guy like Jacoby Myers. He's looked good so far. Could be the Patriots' #1 wide receiver. Maybe a John Brown, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. I'm going to take a little bit of a risk here. The question is, do I go with Jalen Hurts or Matthew Stafford? I think I may go with Stafford here. Hurts does have the higher upside, but I feel pretty solid with my starting lineup right. And if I do need a second quarterback, it's either because Russell Wilson went down or he's fallen off a cliff, like I mentioned at the end of the season. And so if that does happen, I'd rather have a more consistent guy instead of Jalen Hurts, where we really don't know what we're going to be getting out of him. And look at that. Lucky for us, Cole Beasley did not come off the board. In fact, there were no wide receivers that were picked, a lot of second tight ends, some of these handcuff running backs, and then Trevor Lawrence, and then Los Angeles Rams defense thrown in there. So we're going to finish up our position players with our Cole Beasley draft pick. Just a very consistent option. If all of these other guys, Fuller, Jones, Gage, they all kind of bust, we can't trust them. Cole Beasley is a guy that I feel fine throwing in on a bye week. He's going to go out, get you like 10 to 12 PPR points per game. He may not win you a week, but he's definitely not going to lose it for you. And so he's going to be our pick here. Doesn't really matter who came off the board after us. Teams started picking some defenses. We can't pick any more position players, so we're just locked in on defense and kicker. I mentioned earlier how I stream defenses, so I'm going to go with a kicker at this spot. There's not exactly some great analysis on the kickers. I just like to target a kicker on a high-scoring offense and, one that's just been reliable in years past. So I'm just going to go with Harrison Butker. Had kind of a down season last year, but you just know the Chiefs are going to be scoring a ton of points. He's going to have a lot of field goal attempts, and if he's not getting a lot of field goal attempts, he's going to have a lot of extra points to go with it. So really, it's a win-win everywhere. So he's going to be the guy here. I'm not putting a ton of thought into this, but he's going to be the player. Had a great 2019 season. Had him on a lot of my championship teams, so there's also that attachment there. All right, so this is our last pick here. We're going with a defense. Like I mentioned, I stream defenses. Once we're closer to the season, I'll kind of see, what defenses are matched up in good spots for week one, because I don't really care if they're a top-ranked defense, if they're going up against like the Chiefs or the Bucks week one. Not interested. But for right now, I'll just go with the Patriots. Pretty solid last season, and we're missing a lot of guys with opt-outs. Also, the offense overall should be better, which should help the defense out, better field position, all of that stuff. So going with the Patriots D here to finish up this draft. All right, so this is our final roster. Don't pay attention to the grade. It just kind of grades you on how well you follow their ADP, but that's not what we're interested in. So our starting lineup, Russell Wilson at quarterback, Derrick Henry and Joe Mixon at the running back slots, Amari Cooper and DJ Moore at wide receiver, Darren Waller at tight end, Darrell Henderson in the flex, New England Patriots defense, Harrison Butker kicker, and then our bench is Mike Davis, Will Fuller, Marvin Jones Jr., Russell Gage, Matthew Stafford, and Cole Beasley. I think our quarterback position is very strong. Have a mid-tier QB1 with Russell Wilson, and then just a very safe option in Matthew Stafford, who I think is going to have a great year with the Rams. Very, very, very strong running back room. We only have 4 guys, but it's 4 locked-in startable options with Henry, Mixon, Henderson, and Davis, so I feel good there. Wide receiver, definitely our weakest point. Cooper and DJ Moore are a solid 1 and 2. The bench is looking a little bit iffy, not a ton of super reliable guys, but hopefully they're able to hit, and that's kind of the sacrifice you make when you do take a tight end early, and that's what we did with Darren Waller. Obviously a top-tier tight end, so we feel good there. Overall, I really like this team. I think it's going to have a lot of weekly upside. Obviously, like I mentioned, wide receiver the weakest point, but if Cooper and Moore can stay healthy and even just one of these guys breaks out, then I think we are looking great. Thank you guys for stopping by, watching, and listening. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. How do you think this draft turned out? Would you have made any different picks? Let me know down below. What other drafts do you guys want me to do? Teams, scoring settings, roster setup, all that stuff. Let me know down in the comments. But thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you tomorrow.